l'aspettavano così?
Perché credo in quello che dico.
Questo e basta?
Sì.
Don Giussani ha generato un popolo e io faccio parte di questo popolo.
L'avvenimento in cui Dio entra nella nostra esistenza e tutti, colpiti da una curiosità, sospendono per un istante l'ora e guardano dalla parte da cui viene il grido.
Perché l'aspettavano così?
Perché credo in quello che dico.
Questo e basta?
Sì.
Don Giussani ha generato un popolo e io faccio parte di questo popolo.
L'avvenimento in cui Dio entra nella nostra esistenza e tutti, colpiti da una curiosità, sospendono per un istante l'ora e guardano dalla parte da cui viene il grido.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this meeting, whose title is this session, whose title is The Strength of a Freedom and the Restoration of Peace. I welcome our guests and speakers who are participating in this session today. Marina Sereni, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation.
Un ospite.
Then we have a special guest, Aleksandr Archangel'skij, writer and journalist who comes from Moscow. Giovanni di Lorenzo, director of the weekly magazine Zeit from Hamburg. And from Hamburg, but he lived for 9 years in Rimini. So there are Germans going from Italy to Germany and vice versa. And then Maurizio Molinari, director of the newspaper La Repubblica from Rome. None of us can know what the war that started on the 24th of February holds in store for us. But it has been a deep division of a geopolitical status that had existed for decades. We know that this war is the end of peace and of the fact that peace can be taken for granted. We know that this is the beginning of many questions and problems. And this session of today will discuss and will try to understand what is happening and to give some future prospects, if possible. We don't know whether it's going to be possible to re-establish the international dialogue, which is more focused on one side or on the other of the axis. Hence, the great questions. What should Europe do? Not only the governments, but also the European peoples in order to tackle the new consequences. The first question is going to be asked to Deputy Minister Mrs. Sereni. In many wars and conflicts at international level, international cooperation has been the starting point to re-establish dialogue and to help the peoples who are the first victims of any conflict to tackle diseases, hunger, and to overcome problems. What are the new challenges for international cooperation after the 24th of February? This is the question. The floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for your question. I'm very grateful to the organizers for putting two words in the title of this panel: freedom and peace, and they are very important words. But I will leave this to the debate of the journalists after me. There can be no peace after freedom. I believe that Italian development cooperation is of the utmost importance now. By Italian law, we are an essential tool. We are part and parcel of the Italian foreign policy. What does that mean? What does that imply? Well, the war after the Russian invasion of Ukraine led us to a humanitarian emergency, one of the most serious ones, one of the most severe ones that Europe has been tackling over the past decades. Millions of people have fled Ukraine. There are millions of internally displaced persons in Ukraine, and Italian society and Italian cooperation has, right from the start, worked in order to provide an emergency reaction to the sufferings of the civil population that was hit by the war. But unfortunately, the war in Ukraine has not hidden other crises. So after that dramatic 24th of February, we have to acknowledge that war continues. We have to make everything possible to stop war and to open up negotiations in the spirit either of Helsinki or Yalta. But humanitarian emergency and the response to humanitarian emergency cannot just concern this crisis, because there are many other crises underway. Afghanistan, last year, there were Taliban going back to Kabul. There's Syria, Iraq, the Middle East, and Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, as well as North Africa. So the first challenge after the 24th of February is to be strong enough and to be able to find the resources so that Italy and the international community can engage in this crisis without forgetting the other crises. There's another point. There are global challenges today. And Despite the shock of the war, global challenges require a wide and comprehensive international cooperation. The challenge of climate change, the fight against inequalities and against the pandemic, which are a source of war and which lead to conflicts, all these global challenges require international collaboration. This is why I'm not convinced about the narrative of the West against the rest of the world. If we want to tackle these global challenges, and cooperation is a tool to do that, we need to break this narrative and to continue collaborating and working with countries which are not really close to us or on our side. But in order to fight against all these challenges, in order to provide an answer to global inequalities, we need everyone. We need a strong partnership, for example, with African countries. Now, the challenge of Italian cooperation after the 24th of February is to continue standing by the side of the Ukrainian people, continue to help them, meeting their humanitarian needs, both in Ukraine and in the neighboring regions, as well as Italy, because we have welcomed about 160,000 refugees, women and children in particular, that need to be integrated into our society and communities. On the other hand, we have to continue thinking about other crises, as in we need resources. And resources are always very limited. But Italy got engaged some years ago to have 0.7 of the national GDP for cooperation, international cooperation, and we have done more than that. And in this year's budget, there's even more resources that are increasing. Now, when we talk about resources, I know some people will say that it is more important to support families and companies. We are under extremely difficult economic situation here. But the resources for development cooperation are resources for us, for our safety, security, for peace and coexistence with peoples. Therefore, they must not be invested just out of our generosity. We need to invest them even out of selfishness, because our world is left safe if there is tension and if there are severe inequalities like the ones we see today. Now, I'm going to stop here because I was asked to be short. Yes, you are short, you're brief. I don't know how much time I've spoken. I don't know if I have still some time. Let me add that we are guests of the Rimini meeting, and after some years, there's still this partnership between the meeting and us. Now, we have focused this year on food safety. Because this is a traditional sector of Italian cooperation. We are the headquarters of the Italian UN system in Rome. But we have chosen food safety because after COVID-19, there has been another shock, as in the war of Ukraine, which has led to food danger, food and safety. The Ukraine and Russia account for 30% of world corn, and therefore we need to react against this shock. And we do so by supporting the UN initiative. The UN initiative facilitated by Turkey in order to create corridors for corn coming out from Ukrainian silos to other countries is very important. It is having an impact, a positive impact on the increase in prices in commodities, corn in particular. It is positive, it is good, because this is the first sign of diplomacy during a war, and it is also very important because it is alleviating the sufferings of third countries, especially in Africa, on the southern shore of the Mediterranean, that much depend on the imports of corn and other cereals from Russia and Ukraine. We are here to state that we will support all international initiatives on that direction, and Italy has engaged in a dialogue with Mediterranean countries in order to understand with them what we need to do. In terms of technology, water, research, we need to provide them support for a better sustainability of agricultural and food systems. Last, since we are in Rimini and since we are at the meeting, Italian cooperation would not exist without the civil society, the Italian civil society. You always talk about subsidiarity. It is a word which is dear to you and to us. The effectiveness, the power of Italian development cooperation would not be the same if, in addition to financial and technical resources of different governments, we had not the strength, the skills, and a passion for the person implemented by the organizations of the civil society that move private resources, that allocate private resources, and that can establish relations with different countries. Now we're not just working with the Ukrainian government. Our civil society organizations are also working with Ukrainian civil society organizations, as well as in organizations in Africa, Middle East and Africa, because this is the strength, this is a strong point of our international cooperation, establishing links, relations, people to people, enhancing people in their skills and the skills of the communities we're working with. This bear witness of our passion for the person. Thank you.
Vi invito anche a visitare il padiglione.
Please go and visit the pavilion of the international cooperation that we mounted together with the ministry to show that only cooperation among the different entities of the civil society and the government can provide an answer to all these problems. We all know about more or less about what is happening in Ukraine, although a lot of information is coming late. But we don't know much about what is happening in Russia and how the Russian population is feeling right now. Therefore, I would like to start with a question to Aleksandr Archangel'skij, who came to the Rimini meeting 2 years ago with a speech on the future of democracy. My question is, how is the Russian population living this dramatic moment? Thank you for inviting me here. I'll give you a brief answer to your question. The country is very different. Is very diverse, and we don't have an adequate sociology. So I will only make some personal remarks, and these are the remarks of a scholar and not a politician or a researcher. I was in Europe on the 24th of February, and I immediately went back to Russia. Since then, I've been to many cities, large and small, from the Urals to the Belgorod region, bordering Ukraine, and from Pskov in the northwest, on the border with Estonia, to the cities on the Volga. And I talked to everyone without hiding my position on what is happening. but without imposing it either. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to gain trust from the people. And I talked to employees of large farms, teachers at Tolstoy's estate in Yasmaya Polyana and Pushkin's mansion in Mikhailovskoye, major businessmen and local bus drivers. And my first remark focuses on calm, immobility. Most people see what is happening as a local political military event and not as a great and tragic story. Even those who are against it, one-third of the population, more or less, often look at the situation in a simplistic way. They talk about bad decisions, but don't want to understand the extent of its causes and consequences. Clearly, there are some examples of heroic behavior: the politician Yashin, the journalist and politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, the journalist Marina of Syavnika, who risk spending years in jail, whereas others have already been sentenced. But on the whole, there's a lot of immobility. Perhaps people are psychologically adapting to the situation. They are taking it piece by piece, just like pieces of a mosaic, reassembling the overall picture. But I don't know whether there will ever be an overall picture and what this will lead to. My second remark focuses on distance. There is no longer the general euphoria found in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Huge banners with the letter Z are displayed on public buildings. This is a non-official sign of support, but on the main roads connecting the cities, you can hardly see cars with the symbol Z. Again, I see no strong opposition nor euphoria. I don't know whether this is the calm before the storm or lethargy. That I don't know. Third, division has increased. The division between those who think in a contemporary way and those who are still feeling the imperial trauma. Division between those living in large and small cities, between those who have gone abroad and those who have stayed, between those who watch television and those who try to inform themselves on their own. The smaller the city, the larger the imperial patriotism and the more limited information channels. But, most importantly, there's a fourth point. In the world of man, the law of large numbers doesn't work. This is what you said of people to people. A local bus driver may be a staunch pacifist, and the rich inhabitant of a big city an advocate of violence. It is a personal choice, not a rule. There is nothing set or predetermined. To the majority, the new migrants are benevolent towards those who have remained in Russia, and those who have remained are usually not aggressive. Many Orthodox bishops have sinned with militarist rhetoric, and the Patriarch delivers sermons that sound like briefings by the Defense Ministry. And it is no coincidence that Pope Francis has called him Putin's altar boy. However, there was a letter calling for peace, signed by hundreds of priests, and in many churches at Easter, they prayed for Ukraine. And there were no political statements, but deep personal prayers. And I witnessed those prayers at Easter. I myself went to church. No prominent writer, except for Zakhar Prilepin, has declared in public to be in favor of violence. On the contrary, Duma's special committee, chaired by Prilepin, has just published a list of 142 cultural representatives who do not support the special operation. At the very least, they remain silent. At the most, they spoke out against it. Actually, the committee works so hastily and sloppily that the director of the main state television channel, Konstantin Ernst, ended up on the list of opponents. Teachers are different. They are in a very complicated situation. School is a state institution. Denunciation is trendy, as usual. But at the very least, neutrality is respected in many schools, aggression is not fomented in children, and clashes between students of different families and ideologies are not allowed. Humanitarian values continue to be conveyed based on contemporary culture and the classics, which, incidentally, requires courage in the current context. Now, I will tell you a story where a colleague of mine, the translator Lyubov Sum, was involved. She organized an individual picket with a sign bearing a poem by a 19th century democratic poet called Nikolai Nekrasov, a poem that is part of the school curriculum. And this is the poem. Observing the horrors of war, with each new casualty of the clash, I feel sorry not for the friend or the wife, but I feel sorry not for the hero himself, but for the tears of the poor mothers. How can they forget their children killed on the bloody field? Now I read the police report that stopped her, and I warn you, it's not fiction, it's the real text. Some Lyubov Borisovna displayed an instrument of blatant propaganda, a sign with the inscription. The said blatant propaganda bears verses from Nekrasov's poem, Observing the Horrors of War, written by the author in the last years of the Crimean War under the influence of Tolstoy's Tales of Sevastopol. These works, by Nekrasov, contain a subversive ideology of power, criticizing the government regime for its justification of violence. It's absurd. So, it really requires courage to simply convey traditional humanitarian ideas and concepts. This is not resistance in the classical sense, let alone a political front, but something else. There is the expression standing firm in the faith. It is when a person doesn't go on the attack, doesn't fall prey to anger, doesn't worry about proving to power and society that he is in the right, but neither does he renounce his principles in order to be socially accepted. As Luther wrote, "Here I stand and cannot do otherwise." Today, we see not only people standing firm in faith, but also, I would say, people standing firm in human values, and therefore immobility, fragmented understanding of what is happening, distancing, division, choice of human values, personal choice. On the one hand, it is difficult to make analyses and predictions. On the other, we can still be optimistic about people. History is now focusing on people, individuals. Individuals are easier to overcome physically, but harder to overcome morally.
Grazie per questa sincerità.
Thank you for being so earnest, so frank, and for conveying what is happening in your country and to make that understandable for us. You talked about the value of each individual, and certainly this is a pillar of European culture. So the freedom of individuals, so the inalienable freedom of individuals. So let's now talk about Europe. I would like to ask Mr. Giovanni Lorenzo and Maurizio Molinari, what does this war mean for the EU? And when it comes to Germany for Di Lorenzo and for Italy for Maurizio Molinari. So let's start with Mr. Di Lorenzo. So first of all, good evening, everybody. And I would like to say that maybe some German words may slip into my sentences, so please forgive me for that. So first of all, I want to express respect for what our Russian colleague said, because it's so difficult to live and work in Russia and at the same time being so critical as he was, but at the same time expressing so much melancholy as a literate, but at the same time having a touch of irony. Thank you for your speech and your words that were extremely moving. When it comes to the consequences for the EU, well, first of all, I would like to talk about the consequences for each one of us, because February 24th marked a deep shock also for my generation. That is also your generation, the generation of Mr. Molinari. I think we do all somehow stem from the same generation, but also for younger generations, because everybody thought that peace and freedom are natural rights. Well, actually, they are not. We realized that they've been a gift for over 70 years, but they're not something natural. In Germany, the traumas of Nazism and the war are still there somehow. So it was like reawakening a partially somehow sleeping trauma. So a war blew at a distance of 800 kilometers from Berlin. And there were many Ukrainian, let's say, commuters going back and forth from Ukraine to Germany. And so there was really a huge wave of solidarity that was triggered, especially when it comes to Ukrainian refugees. And so contrary to what many countries in the world may think, Germany proved once again to be an extremely generous country when it comes to welcoming refugees. People are fleeing from famine and war, and maybe one day also from climate change. And I think that in Italy we would have had somehow revolts, because we had more than 1 million refugees in a few months, and that was a big challenge for the whole German society that happened in 2015. But then, after this shock, what happened? Well, Germany, who had always tried to somehow be an economic superpower, but without being involved in geopolitical clashes. So Germany has always tried to stay away from geopolitical clashes, but suddenly it was confronted with a clear request for help. And so a deeply peaceful and peace-loving part of society somehow turned upside down the bearings of society. The party that had showed the greatest level of firmness when it comes to helping Ukraine with heavy weapons are the Green Party. And even the Green electors in March, according to some polls, 90% of the Green Party supporters were in favor of with the fact of giving weapons to Ukrainians, to supply them with weapons. So that marked such a deep and radical change. Let's say that extreme right party and the extreme left party are the parties against this decision. Sometimes there are amazing and appalling similarities between these two parties. And then there are other certainties that are somehow wobbly. When I come to Italy, I'm always surprised by the fact that the debates are the same between Germany and Italy, but in a different way, I mean, with a different extent, because climate change is a big issue in Germany. And the second big fear in Germany is the fear with respect to the energy crisis. And this is a direct consequence of this war. Russia is cutting gas supplies because it's really trying to destabilize as much as possible economies. and at the same time, it wants to destabilize not just the German economy, but also the German society, because prices are going to skyrocket and the inflation is still growing and increasing. So there's a fear about some sort of people uprise risk. So certainly the social consequences will be deeper and greater, certainly. So no day passes without politicians providing tips on how to save water when you take a shower. In Italy, if the same was to happen, people would laugh, probably. Instead, in Germany, this is part of the daily debate.
Bilico, il vice ministro.
Then, the deputy minister said something about the fact that there can't be peace without freedom. And somehow she's right, but unfortunately I'm not 100% convinced of that, because if Ukraine and Russia will reach a peace agreement, and again, maybe with Frau Merkel things would have been different, because Germany so far hasn't taken any initiative when it comes to trying to come to a peace agreement. So I don't know if any agreement of that kind would somehow lead also to freedom, to a sort of freedom-based peace. And certainly freedom does not seem to be a priority. I mean, in Germany, people wish radical changes in people's behaviors and also in, economic choices when it comes to economic policies. So there's a high level of uncertainty, and in my opinion, we are going through maybe the darkest times I've ever experienced in my country. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Di Lorenzo. Now the floor goes to Mr. Maurizio Molinari. Well, I think that there are three key things to be said. First, the Russian aggression of Ukraine has disseminated an idea of aggression in Europe that shows to what extent the identity of the invaded countries want to be erased. So the idea is not simply to conquer land, but to really cancel and erase the identity of the invaded country and people. And this is appalling. And the mastermind of this invasion is Putin, and he denied the identity of Ukraine as independent country. He said that 3 days before sparking off the wars, as if that country never existed, nor its culture, nor its language, as if it was just a part of Russia. And this is appalling, because that would mean leading Europe back to a time that seemed to be behind us, thanks to the creation of the EU, and also thanks to the end of the Cold War. So this is the first fact. And the second fact, and here I'm quoting the words of Senator Segre when I asked her what she thinks about this, and she replied, well, Maurizio, once again, all this depends on one single person, and that is scary, because our enemy is not Russia. Our enemy is not the Russian population. It never was. No one here has enemies in Russia. It was Putin who somehow shaped this image. And it is Putin who is leading the country in this war, in this brutal war, and the Russian army is shooting on the civilians. And this is what all journalists say, and nobody had seen that since the Second World War. There is contempt for the victims. Victims have to suffer, have to die. Women are raped. And this is really horrible. Archangel'skij, former prisoner in gulags for many years, summarized Putin's approach by saying that Putin wants us to be scared. His actions wants to scare Ukrainians, first of all, but also he wants to scare all of us by threatening us with a nuclear war. And also he's trying to scare his own people because he's telling his people that there is no alternative to such a special operation unless they want to take the risk of repression. So he's really trying to somehow sort of support this culture of fear. And I think that Mr. Archangel'skij, who comes, by the way, from Donetsk, is right. And so I think that the right answer is not to be scared. We should not be scared to somehow be on Ukraine's side because they're fighting for independence, freedom, democracy. And we also need to feel close to Russians, to feel, being somehow related to Europe, who share values, emotions, and cultures that we do all share also. They also made a huge contribution to the defeat of Nazism, so we should not be scared to say that there is a clear difference between evil and good.
Perché tutto questo?
And why has this all anything to do with Italy? Well, all this has to do with Italy because Italy is one of the countries where there is a minority public opinion that is against sending weapons to Ukraine and against sanctions on Russia. So this opinion is shared by some Italian political leaders quite openly, and this has also been part of the opposition to Draghi's government, and there's a wide range of social media actors who are somehow connectable to Russian interests. So why is it so that there is such a high Russian pressure in our country? Well, I think that the Putin's government have the idea that both Russia and Italy, well, Italy could be the first NATO and EU country say a clear no to weapons to Ukraine and a clear no to sanctions on Russia.
Nostra campagna elettorale.
I think this is a major argument of the electoral campaign. Each citizen will make their own decision, but I think that this is the very first time that there has been such a high level of influence in the public life of our country as it is now by the Russian Federation. Thank you. Both you and Mr. Di Lorenzo said that somehow Russia shares a European culture, is part somehow Europe. So European culture is strictly intertwined with Russian culture and also with Ukrainian culture. So I have a question for Aleksandr Archangel'skij. Is it possible to think that the cultural relations that exist today, and I hope will still exist in the future, could be the starting point for a reconciliation? On the one hand, the answer to your question is obvious. Europe and Russia today can only meet through culture. The dialogue between the churches has abruptly ceased due to the positions of the Russian episcopate. Science is no longer a platform for objective reasons. Russian scientists are recognized as personalities, but no international cooperation exists and cannot exist. Cooperation is also difficult at the cultural level. Publishing houses stop selling translation rights, film companies and are not selling their rights. Theaters are stopping touring, and the exchange of exhibition is foreseen. If the decision is made to abolish Schengen visas for Russians, not only the admirers of Milan boutiques will suffer, but also those who continue to influence minds inside Russia. They will be more defenseless against arbitrariness. They will have nowhere to take refuge in case of misfortune. But firstly, these problems are incomparable to what refugees are suffering. Secondly, culture is organized differently from science. At least in some sectors, it is able to do without institutions. It requires a personal relationship with the artist, the writer, the thinker. Much within it exists beyond borders, is able to survive even if there is no freedom, and is able to break down the Iron Curtain. Finally, through culture, like through a tube underwater, both the church, deprived of freedom, and philosophy, driven out of the universities, often breathe in Russia. Think about the great novel written by Pasternak in the Stalinist USSR, Dr. Zhivago, a Christian novel, a philosophical novel, a novel published for the first time in Italy in Italian and not in Russian, a novel written by a writer who could not travel abroad from 1936 until his death in 1960. But this did not prevent him from writing the book. Sometimes it seems that focusing on culture is too weak and naive, and that there is no chance of restoring lost trust, and every attempt is useless. And yet, I want to recall that precisely in 1957, when Dr. Zhivago was published in Milan, always in Milan, Father Romano Scalfi, supported by Don Giussani, founded the lay association Russian Christiana. Russia Christiana was a religious as well as a social and cultural project. I want to emphasize the date once again, 1957. In other words, 4 years after Stalin's death, setting up such an association in the West was as pointless as writing Dr. Zhivago in the East. In conclusion, Pasternak's novel was read by millions. A Christian revival in Russia began, albeit slowly. And suddenly it was clear that to anticipate the times, to do what now seems impossible, was actually the only possible choice. Impossible? Then it must be worth a try. This is exactly how the legend goes. Pope John XXIII responded to the objection that convening the Second Vatican Council was impossible. But there is another side to the problem, and there are far more complex issues, and that is, in what forms and on what can we cooperate? Cooperate with what culture? First of all, let's talk about forms. Forms will have to change completely. There will no longer be any usual cultural diplomacy, no exchange infrastructure. So what there will be then? There will be individual cooperation with real people who are real, so people who have come to the West, direct and immediate, with those who have remained in Russia through the platforms they continue to remain. For instance, the Library of the Spirit in Moscow. The task ahead is not to abolish the past, but to talk together about the future. Which ideas and fundamental figures of Russia have stood the test of catastrophe and which have not? And above all, to make the new experience our own. For example, recently, poet Olga Sidakova translated some Ukrainian poets, and at the same time, she wrote a novel translating Dante. She published a work translating Dante, where you find the translation of the Purgatorio in Paradiso, and Dante's work is related to our culture, but the dialogue with this Russian culture is possible and necessary. And so we see that there are long discussions on social media, and there is a lot of concern in Russia that we're being raised in the world. This is stirred up by television and long by discussion raised on social media. But first of all, it is actually the police report on the accusation of Tolstoy. They mentioned it is raised in Russian culture. Secondly, Pushkin and Bulgakov are indifferent to whether their monuments still exist or not. It is not so important what will become of a block of metal. What is important is something else, whether innocent people will suffer, whether peace is possible after the catastrophe, whether the good feelings and mercy celebrated by Pushkin in the poem entitled Monument will win out. If we, based on culture, can build a different society and give a new order to the world, then Pushkin too will be safe and sound. It will be read and will be talked about. If not, there will be no Pushkin to save us. For the time being, we have to work on mistakes. Now, I am not talking about power, which is too far away from us and for which I'm not prepared to answer, but first of all, about my own mistakes. For example, we must change our perspective, broaden up our listening, learn from the experience of others. Let us say, from the experience of free Ukrainian poetry of the 20th, 21st centuries, to experience its beauty and intensity, and perhaps we will rediscover something in ourselves. Many years ago, I visited a museum that is in Perm on the site of a lager for political prisoners in the 70s, 80s. It is in the Urals area. I was guided in the museum by dissident Sergei Kovalyov and one of the founders of the Memorial Association. And there's an exhibition at the meeting on this. And that man was Arseny Raginsky. Both Kovalyov and Raginsky had been both detained in this lager. It was then that I first heard of the Ukrainian poet and prisoner Vasily Shtus, who died in Perm during the first years of Gorbachev's rule. In protest, he had called a hunger strike from which he would not return. When I read Shtus's verses, many things in life became clear to me. And I want to end my speech with one of his poems, which sounds like a commandment of Stoic humanism for me. And perhaps there's a hope that the human dimension will win in the human being. And so I asked the translator to read the text. And I would also like you to hear it in Ukrainian. So endure, endure, patience shapes you. Your spirit is tempered, and you endure, endure. No one will save you from misfortune. No one will take thee from thy path. There thou abidest and preparest till death, until the light and the sun. Stay, stay. May you walk all your path to heaven, or hell, or captivity, and may you endure it. Create your own path, the one called your own, the one that has chosen you for the eternal ages. To it you have consecrated yourself from childhood. The Lord himself has condemned you to it.
Терпець тебе шліфує, сталить твій дух, тож і терпи, терпи. Ніхто тебе з недолі не врятує, ніхто не зіб'є з власної тропи. На ній і стій, і стрій, допоки скону, допоки світу й сонця стій і стій. Хай шлях до раю, пекла чи полону, усе пройди і винести зумій. Торуй свій шлях, той, що твоїм назвався, той, що обрав тобі на віки вік. До нього змалку ти заповідався, на нього сам Господь тебе прирік.
Io penso che
I think that a Russian colleague reading a Ukrainian poem is of good omen, great omen. And I want to ask Maurizio Molinari, after the Second World War, two countries like France and Germany, they were enemies. The Second World War had a lot of atrocities, and these two countries managed to make peace. And together with Italy, they became the three countries that created the European Union. So our knowledge of freedom, our awareness, the awareness of what the dignity of a person is strong enough to make the Union able to tackle problems and to create bridges with these countries hit by the war. Is it really so? Well, it's an interesting question. It's a right question, a deep question, and it tells us that the challenge of Europe is to come out of the Ukrainian war stronger and more united. Will Europe want to do it? Will Europe want to be a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals? I do believe so. What is the lesson to be drawn from France and Germany after the Second World War? The lesson is that these two countries together shared with other Europeans the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the idea that the crimes against mankind had been perpetrated and that these crimes had to be punished. The punishment of the crimes committed was the starting point of the re-establishment of the state of law after Nazi fascism. And the respect of the human rights in the Universal Declaration were one of the founding pillars of the European House. There is no reason not to repeat this precedent with Eastern countries and Russia. All these people are individually responsible for the crimes committed against Ukraine, against Europe. It's not Russia. It's a man. So the point is, if there's going to be an after Putin, will there be an era after Putin where Russia will be able to share values with the rest of Europe? And the need to punish the committed crimes and the need to build a bigger Europe. I deeply believe in that. I believe that Europe and the West, after the end of the Cold War, made some serious mistakes with the Russian Federation because they wouldn't listen to people crying for help, collaboration, to develop deep reforms. They accepted simple solutions. They neglected the liberal leaders of Russia at the time. And if that opportunity comes back again, we should not make the same mistakes. And the turning point to shift from destruction, which we're witnessing today, to construction of a bigger Europe that is able to include Russia, is the time when the crimes committed during the war are punished based on the rule of law in which Europe does believe. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Giovanni di Lorenzo, you are reading a book, and I've seen an interview of Florian Illes. In Italian, the title is Love at the Time of Hatred, a Sentimental Stories of the 1930s. And you're reading the book in Italian. No, I'm reading it in German, actually. In this book tells the impact of the story of the 1930s. It was a dramatic story, tragic one, and how this story had an impact on the life of individuals. These are love stories that took place in the 1930s in a tragic context. By analogy, what is happening to our freedom? What is now happening with social coexistence? Is it going to be belittled by these challenges? Are we going to divide further? Or will we be able to see that there's something uniting us more than any other problems because we have something that we have to build up together and that is more important than any other conflict? Now, I don't know, to be honest, because this war is a crisis, and the consequence of this war is that it is hitting societies which are already divided. So by miracle, if we manage to unite, well, that would be a miracle. I know that Mr. Molinari said that everything will depend on the unity that we can have in individual countries and in the European community. Now, to go back to your previous question to our Russian colleague, this is not the opinion of my newspapers because we are very divided on that. I am personally against any cultural sanction against Russian artists, because I think this is the worst thing that we could do, and the easiest one too. Culture can unite, but if we want to show that we are morally better than others, then we cannot ban a tenor or an orchestra conductor. On Monday, I was in Salzburg, and I watched the a concert given by Riccardo Muti, living in Ravenna, near here, and he conducted a concert by Tchaikovsky. That was a demonstration, and the Russian basso was a singing, and that was made on purpose to show that culture must not divide, but rather unite. As for the future prospects, if good will manage to defeat evil, I don't know. I'm somewhat skeptical. I don't know whether it's just one person and not the Russians. It is always wrong to generalize, but we need to say that at least 70% of the Russian population is in favor of the war in Ukraine, of the special operation in Ukraine, which cannot be called war, otherwise you are sentenced in jail for 15 years. The Russian community in Germany has access to all the sources of information, even the most critical ones. And they are also, by majority, in favor of the war in Ukraine. And this is a reason for concern. This is not just the result of a perverse idea and of a violent idea of the political nomenclatura, but it is an idea that is rooted in the population. I believe that the only thing that can lead to a turning point is our determination to suffer. Because Putin believes that we are too weak to suffer from an embargo, for example, that we wouldn't be able to suffer from it. Well, I'm convinced that leaving aside the nuclear powers, the Russian army is really very weak. There are NATO generals who say that, off the record, that a NATO intervention would win over the Russian army in 3 days. And I don't really believe in the economic strength of Russia. So we have to defend our values also from an economic point of view, and we have to have we have to stand still. We have to have a clear stance on that. I don't have anything more optimistic to say about this because the situation is very serious. It is serious indeed. It is serious indeed, and we have talked about it in a serious way. We have heard many different perspectives, and we will think about what we have heard, about what we will be reading tomorrow, and what we will hear tomorrow. Clearly, this is a crisis with many dramatic aspects, which is very dramatic. Thank you very much to all the speakers for being so honest with us in their answers. They have not pretended to know more than they know, but they have given us their personal remarks. I thank you warmly, all the speakers, and thank you very much, especially to Aleksandr Archangel'skij.
all'incontro che
Let me invite you to the session that we're going to have tonight on Ukrainian culture, and that there's going to be on Thursday night. There's going to be a session between Ukrainians and Russians, and the last night with very brave women. Oftentimes, women are more brave than men, women from Russia and Ukraine. Please go and visit the exhibition on Memorial and the Pavilion in International Cooperation. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for your contribution now and in the future. Thank you.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Perché l'aspettavano così?
Perché credo in quello che dico.
Questo e basta?
Sì.
Don Giussani ha generato un popolo e io faccio parte di questo popolo.
L'avvenimento in cui Dio entra nella nostra esistenza e tutti, colpiti da una curiosità, sospendono per un istante l'ora e guardano dalla parte da cui viene il grido.
Perché l'aspettavano così?
Perché credo in quello che dico.
Questo e basta?
Sì.
Don Giussani ha generato un popolo e io faccio parte di questo popolo.
L'avvenimento in cui Dio entra nella nostra esistenza e tutti, colpiti da una curiosità, sospendono per un istante l'ora e guardano dalla parte da cui viene il grido.